John Jones is comfortably the greatest light heavyweight fighter of all time and is one of the most dominant forces in MMA history in his prime. There's no denying that, but unfortunately the UFC took it a step too far and chose to push the narrative that he's the greatest fighter of all time regardless of weight class, and a big chunk of MMA fans have bought into this claim. Jones terrorised the light heavyweight division for over a decade, but his resume largely consists of name value more so than quality and tough stylistic matchups. The likes of Shogun Rua, Rampage Jackson, Lyoto Machida, Rashad Evans, Vitor Belfort and Chael Sonnen were all household names when Jones beat them, but they were also either middleweights, small light heavyweights or previous generation fighters. Jones had a significant height and reach advantage over all of them, so he had a simple game plan that none of them had the tools to expose. Most of them plodded forward in straight lines, so Jones would just kick them at range, and if they tried to enter the pocket he would either clinch up or use his length advantage to retreat with his arms and fingers extended in their face or frame away. Machida was active with lateral movement and had some success kicking and countering Jones with blitzes, but Jones' chin was just too strong and he eventually broke Machida with grappling and elbows. Jones' title reign was plain sailing until he ran into a light heavyweight with a similar frame to him in Alexander Gustafsson. Gustafsson was active with lateral movement to trouble Jones' kicking game and enter the pocket from favourable angles to utilise his crafty boxing. Jones couldn't just retreat with his arms and fingers extended or frame Gustafsson away to avoid his attacks like he could against smaller opponents, so he ended up on the receiving end of a lot of damage. To Jones' credit, he was tough enough to eat everything Gustafsson landed on him, and he was intelligent and composed enough to make adjustments throughout the fight and steal the win in the last 2 rounds when Gustafsson started gassing out. Having said that, Gustafsson exposed a clear weakness in Jones' game, which was his poor ability to deal with lateral movement and pocket boxing against opponents with a similar height and reach to him. After beating Gustafsson, Jones went on to brutalise Glover Teixeira at range and in the clinch, before facing the best opponent of his career in Daniel Cormier. DC was a strong athlete and wrestler with relatively decent striking, but he was also a favourable stylistic matchup for Jones. DC had a significant height and reach disadvantage, so he had to close the distance on Jones to have any success. The problem with this was that DC pressured Jones with ploddy linear footwork, so he often struggled to cut the cage and was a stationary target for Jones to hit. Not only that, but Jones was arguably the best clinch fighter of all time and had elite defensive wrestling, so DC couldn't have much success with his grappling either. DC was notoriously bad at defending, taking and reacting to body shots, so Jones made it his mission to land them repeatedly throughout the fight. As a result of chasing Jones around the cage and eating body shots, DC gassed out as the fight went on and Jones took over to secure a clear decision win. After cruising to a comfortable but dull decision win over journeyman Ovin St. Preux the next year, Jones approached the rematch with DC the same way he did the first fight, except this time he went high with one of his kicks and TKO'd DC in the 3rd round. DC on the other hand didn't adjust much aside from boxing a bit more and grappling a bit less, which didn't have any significant impact on the fight. Jones' next fight was a rematch with Gustafsson, who in their first fight proved to be a much tougher stylistic matchup for him than DC was. Gustafsson did suffer a lot with injuries and took a lot of damage since his first fight with Jones, so he was definitely past his best by the time the rematch came around, but Jones still deserves credit for how well he adjusted to him. He clinched and wrestled more often and more intelligently, and it resulted in a dominant win via 2nd round TKO from ground and pound. At this point, Jones had overcome both the best opponent of his career and the toughest stylistic matchup of his career. This is a testament to Jones' quality, but it's also a reflection of how poor his competition actually was throughout his prime. Over the next few years of Jones' post-prime career, more cracks started being exposed in his game. Against the former middleweight journeyman Anthony Smith, Jones cruised to another comfortable but dull decision win similar to the one against St. Preux a few years prior, where he struggled to do any harm on the feet or with his grappling. After that, another former middleweight journeyman in Thiago Santos arguably beat Jones despite blowing his knee out in the first 15 seconds of round 2 in a freak accident. Santos spent the majority of the fight out-kicking Jones on the outside and blitzing him with punches whenever Jones tried to pressure him, and Jones had no clear answer for it, so it's safe to say Santos' injury saved him from an embarrassing loss. The last fight of Jones' light heavyweight career was an undeniable robbery decision win over Dominic Reyes, another fighter who's nowhere near the elite level but still gave Jones a lot of trouble. Reyes outkicked Jones on the outside similar to how Santos did, and he boxed him up in the pocket with mostly straight punches and basic combinations. A rematch between the two was definitely warranted considering the controversy of the judge's decision, but Jones conveniently decided to call it a day at light heavyweight and sit out for over 3 years before booking the vacant heavyweight title fight with Cyril Gane on the same day Francis Ngannou left the UFC. Just over a year before fighting Jones, Gane was taken and held down multiple times by a badly injured and gassed out Ngannou, which ultimately cost him the title. It would have been fair to assume Gane would have significantly improved his grappling defence between then and the Jones fight because of this, but he evidently didn't. Jones submitted him in the first round after a series of poor grappling sequences from both fighters, which I broke down in my previous video linked in the top right corner of this video and the description below. The fight was one of the lowest quality male title fights in recent MMA history, so I shouldn't have added nearly as much to Jones' legacy as it did in the eyes of the masses. Attaching a vacant belt to a win doesn't make it any more impressive, especially when he spent multiple years ducking the previous champion because he was a much tougher matchup. All in all, Jones' reputation as a fighter among the masses is highly inflated relative to his actual fighting ability and the quality of his resume. DC, who was a favourable stylistic matchup for Jones, was the only elite fighter Jones ever beat, and even then he was only elite relative to his weight class because his weight class was so poor. Jones also showed both during and after his prime that any decent fighter with a decent game plan and similar frame to him would give him trouble, and this definitely isn't indicative of a fighter who should be labelled as the greatest of all time, above the likes of Jose Aldo, George St. Pierre or Demetrius Johnson.